Hello and welcome to They're Just Robots, podcast on robotic control. Brought to you by Enforced Social Isolation and Harun Shilek.
Thought you had plenty of friends, more than you could ever really want. But really, sometimes they're not what you need. They can't do it all, cause they're only human. True kind of pal would drop all that she's doing. You need a true friend, and we've got lots. They're just ROBOTS robots.
Hello and welcome back. This is episode 11 of They're Just Robots, and today we're wrapping up with the story of deep learning. Now, not to mystify things, deep learning is not that different fundamentally in the context of the parts that constitute it from what we've seen so far. It's still the story of your regular neural network. It still has neurons. It's still the concept of, let's say, the perceptron as we've seen it before, or even the multi-layered perceptron as I've seen before. That's already a step towards deep learning and could be a deep neural network on its own. Now the question is just how deep. As it turns out, if we keep on increasing the depth, if we keep on increasing the number of layers between the input and output layer, we can get some interesting, some very good results in learning. But in the days past, there were issues with that. So for instance, you had an issue of something called the vanishing gradient, which means that in between layers, as you go on and learn things, as you explore, as you do the backpropagation, you end up losing the gradient, losing the quantity of the gradient just because numbers, just because approximations work that way. And all of a sudden, you're not able to train your network anymore because the information is lost. Overcoming the problems such as the vanishing gradient, the problem of having multiple layers that ask for a lot of weights to be tuned, and combining the layers in structures that have different interconnections. All of that led to the establishment of the new field of deep learning, and with its new architectures, it gave us some new results that concretely in the field of robotics opened up new questions. And that's pretty much what we want to talk about today, the new questions in robotics triggered by deep learning. So what challenges could it address? What challenges does it have on its own in the context of robotics? And just how much more can it provide compared to non-learning methods and other learning methods. And then again, other learning methods, that's pretty much a misnomer, because deep learning pretty much covers all the learning techniques we've seen so far. It just does them in a deep manner. So it does them with multiple layer structures, which can be very large. But still, there's the supervised, unsupervised, reinforcement learning. It's all still there.
Say that dog is man's best friend. That might very well be true. But every bone that a canine buries, but to do better, steadfast and truer. Fetch any stick, bring your papers, slippers, available in fur, and they don't need wax, they're just ROBOTS robots.
Continuing the tradition of reading review articles, today we're reading a review of deep learning in robotics by Pearson and Gashler. And that paper gives us a nice mapping of the challenges in robotics versus challenges in deep learning. So, which challenges that have been put in front of roboticists, in front of researchers in robotics, could be tackled by deep learning in the future, like in the next 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. And a list of 7 items emerges, starting with number one, learning complex, high-dimensional, and novel dynamics. Now that may sound vague, but complex essentially means that we have multiple objects, multiple manipulators, multiple everything, so that at some point there's just too much uncertainty to grasp everything in a single, relatively speaking, simple model. High dimensional, again, add more degrees of freedom, add more potential options of interaction, and there's your high dimension. And novel dynamics, well, it pretty much means that you, as a robot or as the controller of the robot, have to expect the unexpected. So let's say this is a story of a manipulator that's in a setup of multiple manipulators, and it needs to grasp a new object. So there's some novel dynamics to learn, how to grasp a novel object. And maybe the environment changes. Maybe the system of manipulators is moved from one place to the other, or just the contents of the space around it have changed over time. Something new arrived, something left the room, and so on. And then again, what if one of the manipulators or one of the parts of the manipulator just fails? So in that sense, you have to handle failure of the system, at least a partial one. You don't really have to fix it, which would, of course, be cool, which some modular robotic structures do with self-healing, but you at least have to carry on doing the task, but being aware that a certain part of the system is malfunctioning and should be left out of the whole plan. And that is again learning novel dynamics, something you just couldn't predict because there's just too many parts, there's just too many different ways in which the system could fail. So you couldn't just prepare a case-based reasoning for them all. As such, of course, all the novelty, be it a new object, a new environment, or handling failure, that's a task for something along the lines of, say, unsupervised learning, because you couldn't provide training data through your regular supervised learning because it's not a classification task, it's not a task dealing with known parameters of objects that have already been seen. But what's also an option for this particular task is recurrent neural networks. So if you are able to use recurrent structures, you can model your system as a dynamic system it is. So you have the effects in time over the dynamics of the system with control inputs and the effect the control inputs make on the system itself. So in a way, the holy grail of robotics modeling, the story of robot as a dynamical system captured in a form that is reusable. Well, maybe you don't get the whole holy grail with the recurrent neural networks, but you get a glimpse of it at least, as it encompasses the temporal effects. It encompasses the effects of inputs, be them the control inputs and the input from the environment on the dynamics of the whole system. So there is hope for the robot to learn how to handle objects never seen before, how to act in situations in which the configuration suddenly changes. All that can happen, and there are means in deep learning that could help us with it. Now, the second challenge is learning control policies in dynamic environments. So, again, imagine we have a multi-arm manipulator in a high uncertainty environment. So all of a sudden, nothing is taken for granted anymore in this environment because it just keeps on changing. The sensing, if you have it, will produce results that might not be expected, might be inaccurate in the next time step because everything again changed. And in such an environment, you need to set up a control policy for your robot. You need to establish some safe strategies for executing a task. And the word policy in this particular challenge is already a giveaway. It's already a hint that reinforced learning, as you can remember from the last episode, is the way to go, because it provides you with policies. It provides you with the strategies that will give you the best reward in a situation that is dynamical, in a situation that doesn't have a static landscape in which a single policy always works because nothing ever changes. So, in the manner of reinforced learning, do a bit of exploration, do a bit of exploitation, and balance the two, and you will be able to learn some control policies for environments that are full of uncertainty, and yet you will be able to keep everything as safe as possible in case you've counted in the whole story of rewards. So remember, reward shaping is a big issue in reinforced learning. The next challenge listed is one of advanced manipulation. So let's say again, there is a manipulator that's supposed to handle something relatively delicate. Sure enough, most experiments in the old times with haptics and gentle manipulators included handling eggs and similar deformable or breakable shapes. But what if it's something with a complex shape that needs to be grasped from a particular angle, otherwise it just slips or breaks, etc. Maybe it has a handle on one side. Maybe its topology is very complex, and maybe even it changes with the touch of the manipulator, so it's deformable again. And what if handling those objects that have complex shapes is actually actuating the environment? So it's producing an effect. It's actually pushing a button or opening a door or pulling a lever or putting in a screw or so if there is a complex effect with handling a complex shape, that might act in a complex way. So it might deform, it might break, it might separate, it might fuse, it might stick. There's so many options. So for such an advanced manipulation task, we again have to have a learning strategy. We have to have something that will allow the manipulator to learn how to handle such shapes. Now, given that we didn't say that these shapes are necessarily something new and unheard of, and that maybe the robots could learn on one class and say transfer the knowledge to another similar class. Supervised learning could be a fairly decent solution for this, and with the ability to say do robotic vision and to perceive the object, to learn its properties. So first of all, to discover it in space, then to discover its degrees of freedom, then to estimate its properties and remove the features that are not important. So the color of the screw may not be that relevant as long as it's the proper size, or as long as it's positioned properly. So, and that once those tasks are solved, and given that there is knowledge of at least something about the objects that are about to be handled, supervised learning is the way to go. And here there's also the challenge of this manipulation asking for coordination of different parts of the robot. Maybe it's opening the door and sliding another part of the robot behind the door. So there could be a complex motion attached to it that needs to be coordinated. And as you can see in all of the challenges so far, we kept on using the word complex. So if our deep learning strategy can handle complexity, we're good to go. Closely related to this third challenge is the fourth of advanced object recognition. I mentioned a bit about that already, discovering the object, estimating its properties, discovering its degrees of freedom, and reducing its set of features to the features that are relevant. That's all, again, a task for methods like supervised learning. Well, okay, the feature extraction could be handled by unsupervised techniques as well. But in fundamental discovery of properties, these properties could be references to known classes. So as such, it could be handled with training on large sets of known objects. But task number 3 and task number 4, the challenge number 3 and challenge number 4, manipulation and recognition are inseparable in the sense that this is not a computer vision course.
Cut your hair and look after your mother. Make your soup when you're sick of all the things that to a person are a bother. Take out the trash and vacuum your carpets. Listen to you when you're sad and confused. Give you directions when you're lost. They're just R-O-B-O-T-S robots.
So what did that cliffhanger of this not being a computer vision course mean? Well, computer vision is the act of recognizing things, putting things in memory, identifying things based on sensory inputs. And that's all good. But robotic vision on the other hand, is doing actions based on whatever is seen. So it's not just putting things in memory, it's actuating based on things the robot sees. So the whole recognition of the object, the robot sees a particular screw or a ball or a peg or a human, and based on the identification of the object, decides what to do with it. Should it pick it up? Should it sound an alarm because there's an unexpected object in manipulation area? Or should it just ignore the said object? All the tasks have some sort of an action attached to it. They have tasks that have a certain hierarchy, a certain structure, and recognition is almost never just recognition. Now, speaking of robots and unexpected people in manipulation area, task number 5 is the challenge number 5 is about interpreting and anticipating human actions. That's a huge part of collaborative robotics. So if the robot and the human exist in the same space and collaborate on a task, or if the robot is assisting the human in everyday life, if it's part of rehabilitation, medical assistance, whatever the task of the robot within the human environment is, there needs to be some sort of an interaction and an interpretation of the human actions, be it a gesture made by the human or the motion of the human that could cause damage to the robot because of accidental clashes, or it could be a request by the human for robotic assistance that needs to be interpreted as a request. All of those ask for the robot to be able both to interpret the human action, so to put it in a certain box of good, bad, indifferent, request for action, and so on, and to anticipate them. So based on one action, based on the history of action so far, what might the next action be, and based on the human being here and this time instant, where could the human be in the next 2 seconds, because we don't want an accident to happen. And there again, the story of recurrent neural networks comes to the rescue, because it's a dynamical system. The human is a dynamical system on its own. The human is a glorified robot with a lot of degrees of freedom and pretty soft manipulators and a pretty dynamical behavior, which is controlled by a relatively rational controller. And in such a context, the learning of human behavior, interpretation of it, and integration with the robotic behavior is a task for a model that can encompass a dynamical system, that can speak of actions in time, that can interpret the effects of control inputs and sensory inputs on the system itself. Be that system just a robot, be that system just the human, or be the system the structure, the synergy of the human and the robot. Challenge number 6 is something we've mentioned briefly earlier on when we were speaking of discovering objects and estimating its useful properties. It's sensor fusion and dimensionality reduction. Because, we have a lot of sensors right now, and we're putting many more in the environment on the sensors, and we're getting more and more data. Say we have higher sampling rates, we have higher resolution, and so on. But all of that data is not relevant. Again, the color of the ball or the screw or the eye color of the human that's in the environment with the robot might just not be relevant, and yet the training of neural networks asks for relevant data. Otherwise, we have just an exponential explosion of parameters to tune that actually make little sense. So to fuse the inputs from multiple sensors into something that could be relevant information, and to reduce the dimensionality just to the items that are relevant to the robot, to its task at hand, we could use unsupervised learning. In particular, we could use autoencoders. As autoencoders reduce the dimensionality of the input to something that fits the controllers, the robots, the learning systems vision of the world. It is a means of compression, and as such, it ignores the irrelevant parts of the provided inputs. And as suggested already, sensor fusion and dimensionality reduction is obviously a great support tool for everything we've mentioned so far. And with that in mind, a lot of these tasks, as we will see, are actually joined into bigger goals, bigger challenges in robotics. If the robots are supposed to walk around with humans, they need to learn complex high-dimensional and novel dynamics. They need to be able to do advanced object recognition and then do the advanced manipulation to open doors that they've discovered somewhere on a house, or and to interpret the human motions, to keep lowering the dimensionality, because hey, a small robot in a big world will see a lot and it can be easily overwhelmed. So let's keep it minimal, the sensory pressure on the robotic controller. And finally, the seventh challenge is one of high-level task planning. That's a behavioral one, and that goes back to the first thing we've drawn on the whiteboard in WE413, the hierarchical control. There is a mission that takes a set of tasks that again translate into primitives, into trajectories, and so on. And as such, they compose a hierarchy that's performed by different layers of the software and the hardware, and in the end results in mission accomplished. So if the robot is supposed to go and buy milk today, what are the subtasks? It probably needs to open the door, get out, get to the store, get milk, come back, open the door again. In the meantime, it probably should have taken the money, or probably it has this contactless payment somewhere on top of a manipulator. But still, there are parts of the task that parts of the mission, particular tasks that might not be recognized in a decomposition that we do right now just by thinking. So the robot needs to do a decomposition based on seeing what works, what brings the highest payoff. And that again implies that reinforcement learning could help. But also recurrent neural networks. Why not? It's a dynamical story altogether again. It's a change of dynamics in time. It's the effect of inputs on the outputs on the system. It fits. So it's such a good model. Why not use it?
Technology is our Lord, given to us by a friend. Pathways of current and sound, hoping to find a bite that is not short but round.
That was the optimistic part of the story. Now for the realistic one, we have the challenges that deep learning faces in robotics. So the ones that ask for help from roboticists and from machine learning people. How can we do this in the real world, outside of zeroth order approximation, spherical cow world of simple robots? First of all, where do we get the training data? Because we said it already, providing training data, providing a possibility for the robots to test strategies, doing anything on real robots is expensive in sense of time, in sense of the robot itself that could be brought into a configuration that harms it, that time, money, resources in the environment that are perishable. There's just too many things constraining us most of the time when handling big robots in complicated scenarios. So where do we get the training data from? You know, we need millions of samples sometimes to have a reliable result of training because of a lot of degrees of freedom, a lot of angles, a high precision, high resolution necessity. So the story there is sometimes it works if you generate data from a very precise simulation. That's grand if that works. Sometimes you can manipulate the data you've got already by adding a bit of noise here and there, or if it's, say, a video, you could accelerate and decelerate it and produce different videos that have nonlinear time that could represent an imitation of different scenarios. But in general, we have to face the fact that usually we don't have a lot of genuine data to work with. Another challenge is the training time. With a lot of layers in deep learning networks, with complicated systems that have a lot of weights to tune, you just have to have a lot of hardware resources, a lot of time at your hands, a lot of energy, which then again means a big carbon footprint of your algorithm, of your deep learning controller. And each one of those can be highly restrictive for a particular application you have. Yet another challenge is how to estimate uncertainty of your deep learning controller, of the algorithm that provides you with an answer, but you don't actually see how uncertain that answer might be. And how could you fuse that with prior knowledge and other sensory data. So maybe you could actually give an advice to your robot, to your deep learning controlled robot based on the prior knowledge, but you don't know how to provide that prior knowledge advice, how to combine it with whatever the robot does, and reduce the uncertainty in recognizing something, in performing a particular action, and so on. Very closely tied to this question of estimating uncertainty and estimating anything in deep learning is the question of how are we certain that we can use such a system in risky environments, in environments in which one mistake could potentially be catastrophic, be it a robot that performs surgery or a robot that works in a nuclear power plant. They all have these high levels of accuracy required, and every mistake costs either a lot of money or, even worse, human lives. So how to use something that's in most cases a black box in an environment that asks for accountability, for a high level of precision and reliability, and in which someone is going to do an audit and going to do a forensic investigation if things go wrong. How do we blame the robot? Who do we blame? And why did we end up in the situation of blaming anyone in the end? Why couldn't this have been avoided? So how to make sure that these robots don't make catastrophic mistakes. Finally, there is also the question of how well does the knowledge transfer? How well does the particular learning made on one robot transfer to another that performs in a similar or dissimilar environment, in a task that might be somewhat related, somewhat unrelated, or in the simplest of forms, how do we transfer a learning algorithm from a particular simulated robot to the robot that's deployed somewhere out there in its physical embodiment? Because there are always these slight differences, these slight uncertainties. So do they widen the gap, or does the gap close as we transfer the knowledge? If basically, does learning how to ride a bike on a particular model of the bike mean that the robot can ride an arbitrary bike? And how well could the robot ride a motorbike? All of that is a question of deep learning per se, but also the question of transfer learning as another discipline in machine learning. Learning things on slightly different problems and seeing if it helps with a problem that we're actually interested in. And that could also save us the trouble of getting the data, because maybe there is a cheaper way, a cheaper robot, a cheaper task that could serve as the data generator for learning a strategy for a more complicated, a more expensive task we're actually interested in. With that, we conclude today's episode of They're Just Robots, and we conclude the EE413 course. I hope you've enjoyed the course, learned something new, and that it will be useful in the future, that you can transfer some knowledge to the problems that you're going to encounter in the future and solve them successfully using whatever technique you pick, because in the end, they're just robots.
Don't be afraid, 'cause they're made of metal. They still got plenty of heart. You should think of it like it was a garden. There's fruit on the trees and you can pick it. Just don't piss them off, 'cause robots don't stick it. You need some friends and we